So last week I shared that amidst the miracle of resurrection, that miracle of the risen Lord, that there was another miracle, the miracle of how this one small, disparate group of folks who were followers of Jesus were somehow transformed and will someday be transformed over centuries into what is now the global community of followers of Jesus. And the miraculous nature of that is in some ways easy to understand when we read in the Gospels about how, about these very same disciples and how more often than not they could be described as more confused than not. More often than not there was infighting, arguing about who was going to be the greatest among them. More often than not, their response to Jesus whenever he taught was something like, "What?" More often than not, this confused community of folks, if you even can call it a community of people, were saying, "Jesus, don't say that," or "Jesus, you can't touch that person," or "Jesus, why are you talking to that Samaritan woman?" They were complaining all the time, just had no real understanding at all, if you think about it. And this is from the Gospels, which are supposed to be kind of cheering for them. This is even their story they're telling about themselves. But somehow that group of people who what I imagine would kind of call them the Three Stooges, these stooges, somehow that group of people, following what would be, one would assume, a death blow to their nascent movement, somehow that group became, using Lisa's story, a butterfly. And we never really reflect often on what happened to them that transformed them so much. So there were really two miracles following Easter: the miracle of the resurrection of the risen Lord, and then the miracle of the resurrection of this community. And obviously for us, the two are connected. And our story this morning is a lot like many of the stories across the gospel about that Easter morning. And as I said before, what we read this morning happened after these two disciples who have left Jerusalem to walk to Emmaus, who were concerned, who were afraid and frightened. And as they walk on the road to Emmaus, they meet this stranger who they engage in conversation, and then they don't really recognize who that is until they invite him into their home and break bread together, and they recognize the risen Lord, and immediately they run off to go tell the other disciples, and our story begins. And it's a very similar story. All these Easter stories share kind of common characteristics. Jesus is always saying over and over in these stories, "Peace be with you." And maybe that's understandable because they were far from peaceable folks at this point, right? It's interesting, in every story, the disciples' response to the risen Lord's presence, and I can understand this, but in odd ways, it's doubt. It's being terrified. It's being afraid. Now, there's a kind of a tinge, you might say, of this sense of, is this possible? Is this a tinge of joy? But over and over, the disciples' initial response from the very beginning to the risen Lord is disbelief. They were terrified. And in our story, Jesus says, "Peace be with you." And in order to assuage that fear, he says, "Do not be afraid." He eats a piece of broiled fish, a kind of odd detail to prove he's not some figment of their imagination, but is real and present amidst them. And then Jesus does something, and you may not have noticed this in all the Easter stories we read in the past and we'll read in the coming weeks. He always gives them something to do. He's always telling the disciples, I'm here, yes, I'm here, but as I have been sent, you are to be sent out into the world. Every resurrection story is about Jesus telling these disciples, yes, I'm here, believe, you can see my wounds, but go forth. And in our story this morning, what he tells them to do is to go forth, and he says, and it's an interesting line I'd never really noticed before, he says, you are to be witnesses. You are to be witnesses. Now, when I hear the word witness, I'm kind of thinking maybe something like a criminal or civil trial where you call witnesses to be in the court, right? That's what how I often think of what it means to be a witness. That, I watched the most recent Law and Order, and I know how it works. So someone comes forward and says, this is what happened, and people believe them, right? But what's interesting, if we understand if Jesus is saying, well, you are to be witnesses to my resurrection, you are to testify. Maybe in many ways, one way to interpret that is to go forth and say we are witnesses who can testify to the truth of this. But it's also interesting to me that science has shown that actually eyewitness accounts that are shared in criminal and civil cases are actually not very truthful in the sense of being accurate. There's scientific study over and over that indicates that our eyewitness accounts, what we see, is not necessarily what's real. There's an organization called the Innocence Project, a group of lawyers who look at capital cases in which people have been convicted of murder, and they find DNA evidence that shows that that murderer, the person convicted to be the murderer, actually DNA clears them. And often in more and more of these cases, the reason they were convicted is because there were eyewitness accounts that said they were the one who did it. And scientific research indicates that our perceptions of things, our eyewitness accounts, are often very much shaped by so many different factors. If we're under stress or we're fearful, we don't particularly see things the way they are. Actually, they have indications that if a weapon is present, if people see a weapon, they focus on the weapon and not on the person wielding it. And so their eyewitness accounts, which we think are true witnesses to what happened, are not particularly accurate. In fact, studies indicate if the person you're seeing, that race plays a significant role in the accuracy of what one witnesses. I mean, what's interesting if you think about it is even if we have video, which to me would be a non-biased, in many ways not shaped by human perceptions, even videos that show accounts are interpreted and seen differently. Over and over with our cell phones, video accounts of young black men being shot by police officers, and each side arguing, well, this shows evidence of what really happened. And even though we have that in front of us, we can witness it, we're not sure how accurate it really is. The truth is, seeing is not believing. We see what we believe, if you think about it. human beings. I have this fun thing I'll do with my sister whenever we get together. And like whenever you get with a sibling, often you'll share stories about you'll remember things, family vacations or getting together at dinner or things we did with our parents and with each other, grandparents. And it's always fun to have those memories and share those. But what always blows me away is invariably she always remembers them differently than I do. Somehow I end up being the bad guy. I don't know how that works. But it's true. I'll remember an event in our life, something that happened, and I'll remember it differently. We witnessed it differently, very much so shaped by how we see the world. And so in many ways, when Jesus says, you are the witnesses of these things, in many ways, I think there's a deeper meaning to that than simply providing testimony or assessing to the accuracy of what's happened. I actually think that what he's getting at here is an idea in which the very act of witnessing is important, the very act of bearing witness to something. So witnessing isn't simply seeing it, it's being present to it. To bear witness is to bear witness, to be engaging something at a deeper level than just simply seeing it. There's a great example. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Shall We Dance? Richard Gere, Susan Sarandon. Anybody seen that movie? It's a really fun story about this lawyer who's very successful, middle-aged lawyer, very successful, happy marriage, and but something's missing, a passion in his life, and he passes in a commuter train this dance studio until one day he just kind of gets out of the train and says, I'm going to go up and take some dance lessons. But he's kind of a little bit embarrassed by that, so he doesn't tell his wife, played by Susan Sarandon. And so he stays late. He tells her he's staying late from work, and he's going to these dance lessons because he finds something meaningful in that. He's kind of, again, a little bit embarrassed about it. So he doesn't tell her. Well, she begins to be suspicious. He's late from work, and he's doing something. It's obvious that something's going on with him, and so she hires a private eye to find out, well, is he having an affair? And the private eye follows, takes pictures, and knows he's going to this dance studio where he's learning to do ballroom dancing. And so he meets the wife, Susan Sarandon, at a bar in which he shares that information, which she's greatly relieved. And they have this conversation, a really interesting conversation about what it means to be married. And there's this line from that movie that I find so powerful and meaningful. It's something she says to him about what it means for her to be married. And she says, you know what? We need a witness to our lives. There's 1 billion people on the planet. I mean, what does any one life really mean? But in a marriage, you're promising to care about everything. The good things, the bad things, the terrible things, the mundane things, all of it, all of the time, every day, you are saying your life will not go unnoticed because I will notice it. Your life will not go unwitnessed because I will be your witness. What an interesting way to think about marriage in that way. That this is the person who will bear witness to you. If you think about it, that's what our kids want most from us, right? You think about it. our friends, our family, our spouses, our moms and dads, is that the best thing we can give them, our kids especially, is to have someone bear witness. Have someone pay attention to them. It's one of the best gifts we can give each other, just to pay attention. I thought about this a little bit. In many ways, we might describe spiritual practices, whether it's centering prayer or meditation or even Ignatian spiritual exercises, any kind of spiritual practice. Really what it comes down to is, as one spiritual writer, a modern one, in talking about the Ignatian spiritual exercises, the title of his book is his total definition of what prayer and practices are. It says it's just simply paying attention to God. To bear witness is to pay attention. And what do you pay attention to? It's a good question to ask ourselves. I know, and I have seen over and over again, fathers and mothers and children and husband and wives bear witness to each other, pay attention. And I particularly have known that when someone's dying. If we have the opportunity, if we're lucky enough to be present in the final weeks of their lives, there's what we call holding vigil. But really what you're doing is you're bearing witness. And it sounds so simple and such a little thing, but what a gift. Not only to the one leaving, but to those left behind. And I've seen it over and over and over again, that sense of bearing witness. The power of it. And it makes me wonder, in this very disconnected society and world in which we live in, a society in which people do these seemingly random acts of violence. A young man goes into a school with a gun, and a man shoots people at a concert, and we struggle to understand how is it they do these things. And I often wonder, is it that we're so disconnected that we don't have people, or they didn't have the people who bear witness to them, that they felt so unnoticed and unseen that they lost themselves. You are to be witnesses to these things. You are witnesses to each other, of your lives. That's part of the joy of church, is someone sees me and shares my journey, my struggles, who knows the ups and downs, the sicknesses, the births, the deaths. There's someone there bearing witness, paying attention. We gather on Sunday mornings in worship for this short time, and what we do is we pay attention. We bear witness to these things. And I encourage you, on this wall, in many ways in the coming weeks, the power of bearing witness, people who bear witness to us, who are witnesses to our lives, and people that we are witnesses to their lives. And we ask you to bring pictures of those people that will hang on our wall, so that as we go through this Easter season, they, as well as us, are a witness to these things. And actually, we're going to talk about how that wall expands. It may be some folks very different from ourselves who are witnesses to us and who we bear witness to. I know Kathy Bassett returned from El Salvador this weekend. One of the powers of that trip, one of the most meaningful parts of that experience is that these folks feel like someone bears witness to them, pays attention, notices them, and they bear witness to us as well. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.